When Trump does something that most Americans regard as racist, he typically uses a two-part strategy in response. First, he will simply deny that he is racist. His defenders must often pretend that they do not understand how language works, and they must ignore key parts of history. Second, which is what I'm interested in here, is that he accuses his critics of being racist. This is analogous to how he handled the Kavanaugh situation. His view was that it's not women and girls who are the victims of sexism on the part of powerful men, it's that men and boys are the victims of the sexism of women and girls. This strategy is commonly used to refute those critical of sexism and racism. But does it have any merit as an argument? To assess it, I will follow the principle of charity and try to make the best version of the argument. One common opening move in the argument is to deny or downplay discrimination against minorities. Since I'm trying to make the most plausible version of this argument, this version will not deny that discrimination and racism did exist. One need only point to slavery and past laws that explicitly reference race. It would obviously be absurd to deny that these existed in the past, and the current argument is consistent with accepting this. After all, the claim is not that racism and discrimination never existed, just that it either does not exist now or is far less bad than the critics claim. When making this case, the most plausible way is to point to civil rights, anti-discrimination laws, and the fact that is often pointed out is that, as far as we know, there are no laws on the books that explicitly discriminate against minorities by referencing these minorities in the text of the law. Now, of course, I could be wrong about this. I don't know every single law in the United States, and if you looked at every law in the books, you could probably find all kinds of things. Now, but to move on. And of course, one must also point to President Obama being elected, and people often present that as proof that racism is over. Now, when critics point to cases of discrimination and racism that occur now, the stock counter is to reply that these cases do exist, admitting, okay, yes, there's some of this, but they are very rare. For example, one might eventually acknowledge that, okay, there are racist police, but they are a few bad apples. One might also accept that there are racists who say and do racist things, but of course, they are a small number, and when they discriminate or use violence, their actions are illegal, as people point out. Because of this, one would argue it is fair and just to be critical of that specific racist cop or condemn that particular white supremacist who committed murder. But to speak of systematic racism would be to speak of something that no longer exists. So, if there is no systematic racism, then those who criticize it are criticizing an illusion. Worse, the argument goes, those who speak of systematic racism involving whites are unfairly and wrongly accusing white people of crimes they are not committing. To illustrate, to speak of white privilege, one would argue, is to claim that white people enjoy advantages over minorities. This is to accuse white people of being up to something nefarious, that they are engaged in systematic racism. But since, the argument goes, there is no systematic racism on the part of whites, the accuser must be the real racist. After all, they are acting on an unfounded prejudice and attacking people based on their being white. Thus, the argument goes, those who accuse white people of being bigots and racists are, they claim, the true bigots and racists. One weak point of this version is that holding that racism is just limited to a few bad apples is that there is considerable evidence that discrimination exists against minorities and is more than just a few people being bad. But this more plausible version can be incorporated into the argument. Again, my objective here is to try to make the argument as good as possible to avoid creating a straw man. In this version, is it accepted that racism against minorities does exist, and one admits that it is a problem, but, and this is a big but, that racism and discrimination against white people is on par with this racism? Roughly put, if it is implausible to deny the existence of racism against minorities, one can instead argue that whites are now equal, or perhaps even greater, victims. On this revised version, a white person could accept that there is racism, but insist they are not racist and that they are a victim of racism against whites. They would be victims, one infers, because they've been accused of being racist because they are white, not because there's evidence that they are among the races. If they wish to go beyond defending themselves, they could also contend that whites in general are not racist, and hence the critics of racism against minorities are bigoted against whites by condemning all whites because of some white races. At this point, I must make an aside on quality of reasoning and the truth of claims. When assessing any argument from a philosophical standpoint in terms of achieving truth rather than destroying or owning somebody, that's to say, winning through persuasion by getting one's audience to, accept it as true as opposed to proving it, there are two basic questions when assessing arguments philosophically. The first is the reasoning good? And this is a question of logic. Is it good logic? In the case of deductive arguments, is it valid? In the case of inductive arguments, is it strong? The second question is this: are the premises true, or at least plausible? Now, one can reason well with untrue claims. One can reason badly with true claims, and so on. As such, we need to assess the above reasoning both in terms of the quality of the logic and the plausibility of the claims. Now, on the face of it, the logic of the argument seems to mirror good arguments about racism and discrimination. For example, this would seem to be decent reasoning. A person is accused of being something by another person. The only evidence given by the other person for this is that the first person is of a particular race, and the person being of that race is irrelevant to proving this, and then it'd be reasonable to conclude this person is being racist, because that's kind of the dictionary definition of racism. For example, Barry is accused of being a racist by Karen. The only evidence given by Karen for Barry being a racist is that Barry is white. Barry's being white is obviously irrelevant to proving Barry is a racist, and so Karen here is being racist. So that seems like good logic. But, and another big but, what if someone presents evidence that a person is something, and this is not just based on race? So a person is accused of being something by another person. The evidence given for this is not based on race. The person simply denies the evidence, therefore the accuser is a racist. Now, this is clearly bad logic, although it does not follow that Q is not being a racist, because it neither proves nor disproves this, because the conclusion of a bad argument need not be false. To illustrate with a concrete example, Barry is being accused of being a racist by Karen. The evidence given by Karen for Barry being a racist consists of an abundance of racist tweets, racist statements, racist policies, and so on. Barry denies the evidence, saying he's not a racist. Conclusion: Karen is being racist. Now, this is clearly bad logic. Denying the evidence does not prove that Karen is a racist. She could, of course, be a racist, but this bad logic does nothing to prove that Karen is a racist. Now, what Trump and his fellows are doing, it seems, is trying to run the first argument, the good argument, and that would be smart, since the reasoning does seem solid. If someone is attacking someone based on race, and that's all they got, that is, that would be a racist action. Now, those who are critical of Trump would contend that he can't use that first argument, because the second premise is false. Instead, they would contend Trump can only use the second, the bad argument, in which he just denies he's a racist, in the face of all the evidence to the contrary, and disclaims his critics are racist. The battle, as one would expect, comes down to the truth of the claims rather than the logic. For Trump's "you're the racist" defense to be a good argument, good logic and plausible premises, then he would need to establish some key claims. The exact claims, of course, would depend on which specific strategy is being used. Those who want to deny that racism against minorities, that this racism, doesn't exist, making that claim, would need to prove that. Now, this seems unlikely, given the body of existing evidence. There's very strong evidence that racism does exist. So simply denying racism exists would seem to be, a logically bad strategy. Well, not a logically bad, thing in the sense that it's a bad argument, but in the sense that claims would be untrue. Now, those who claim that it is not as bad as it's claimed by expert critics, and please, no straw people here just making up, someone or picking an extreme person, would need to prove that. Those who claim that discrimination against whites exists and is comparable to racism against minorities would need to also establish that. Trump and his fellows would also need to show that the evidence presented that they are racist does not support this claim. Finally, Trump and his fellows would need to show that those accusing them of racism are acting from bigotry against whites. Interestingly, just showing that he is not a racist, if he could somehow prove that, would not show that those accusing him must be racist. They could be wrong, but it would not follow that they are being racist. They'd simply be wrong about things. And so, if Trump was able to use the first argument and provide, good evidence, establishing all these claims, then his reply would work. The obvious problem is that would seems to be something incredibly unlikely. Because in a way, this matter has been resolved. The evidence of Trump's racism is overwhelming, and a majority of Americans now believe Trump is racist. Now, my point here is that people are accepting the evidence. I'm not committing the appeal to belief fallacy. I'm not saying that he's racist because most people believe it. I'm rather saying that most people believe it because there is evidence. On the other side, Trump's most dedicated defenders assert that he is not a racist, and they assert that they are not racist, something they feel obligated to say seemingly every single day, sometimes multiple times per day. They also assert that those accusing them of racism are the real racists, and that they are victims of discrimination. Now, the overwhelming evidence is that they are not the victims of racial discrimination, despite this belief. They are, however, often right to see themselves as victims, in many cases, of Trump's policies, ironically enough. I will certainly not deny that many white people face difficult challenges. That is clearly true. Corporations have long moved jobs overseas. You look at the Rust Belt. I can look at my own, home state of Maine. My hometown of Old Town was built around, paper mill. And then the paper mill was bought by a bigger company, and then by a bigger company, and then just left. So leaving basically all these empty buildings in my hometown. And now there are houses that are empty, and people are doing the best they can, but that largely, America has been abandoned in quite a few cases by these so-called American corporations. So I certainly would not deny there's a problem there. Wages have also been stagnant for everybody. Healthcare is expensive for everybody. There's an opioid epidemic that's still ravaging America. And of course, most recently, their grotesque mismanagement of the pandemic has done incredible harm to everybody. I mean, it is contended that it's hitting, minorities harder, but it is hurting everybody. But all these harms are not the result of people, being white. They're not the result of the misdeeds of minorities, doing this to them. It's not that, somehow Mexicans are forcing paper companies to move their businesses out of Old Town Maine. What's, causing it, grossly oversimplifying it, is this. We have been crafting a political, economic, and social system for decades. And this system, which has been laid bare by the pandemic, laid it all in the open, is that it hurts everybody who is not rich enough to fare well in this dystopia. And of course, whites are going to get hurt as well, because if you're white but you're not rich, your lack of being rich is going to make you vulnerable. And of course, minorities that happen to have less wealth are going to be hurt even more. And of course, white people who have, very little wealth are going to be hurt badly as well. So, the idea that there is discrimination by minorities against whites, in a systematic way, seems to be untrue. And again, this is a matter of empirical investigation. If people can provide, objective, well-supported data, then that would have to be accepted. Now, in another way, the matter is also resolved. The lines have been drawn, the hats are on, and few are switching teams at this late date.